Welcome, everybody. It's my honor to welcome you all on behalf of IREX and the Chandler Foundation to today's discussion, which is building trust equity, understanding trust building process at the community level. My name is Maura Donlin, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Chandler Foundation. The Chandler Foundation works to promote shared prosperity through building cultures of integrity and advancing social mobility. As some of you know, and many of you have joined us already, we as a foundation have been exploring the idea and the notion of trust. We've been asking ourselves if all good things that human beings have created proceed at the speed of trust and are a function of trust. What, in fact, is the role of philanthropy or social investors in advancing that trust? And over the course of the last 18 months, we've had several discussions, roundtables, and we've devoted some of our thought leadership platforms, some of which you may be familiar with, Social Investor Magazine, and our other ways that we bring people together to explore this issue. And today we have a really great lineup because we're going to dig into specifically what social investors might be able to do practically. We've had a few abstract discussions, a few high-level discussions, but often we find that at the end of the day, people really want to know some practical examples of things that people are doing on the ground. And we have some really good examples today, all of which actually have been put together very succinctly and in a very helpful way by our two colleagues, Kristen Lord, who is CEO and president of IREX, and Elaine Dealin, both of whom are with us today. And Kristen will be leading today's discussion. They have put together, and we'll be dropping this into the chat along with several other resources that we've brought together over time, specifically on the notion of trust. But their piece is called How Philanthropists Can Build Social Trust: Practical Lessons from Partners and Communities. So with that, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of our discussion today. Kristen will be introducing our panelists. Our speakers will be making remarks. There'll be a brief moderated discussion. And then after that, we'll be opening it up for Q&A. And then after that, wrap up. So with that, given the fact that we have such a short amount of time, I'm going to pass it over to Kristen, who will take it away. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, Maura, and thanks to you and everyone at the Chandler Foundation for your longstanding advocacy about the importance of trust, the great work you've been doing to support trust building around the world, and for creating fora like this where people can come together. I'm just looking at the participant list, and it's really an extraordinary group. There are some world-renowned experts on this subject, so I approach it with some humility, but hopefully we can have a good conversation and also talk about how all of us at philanthropic or social impact organizations can integrate trust building into our work in a more concerted way, create resources to do that, and hopefully spread the word. We've covered this in other fora, so I won't delve into it, but there is very strong research, and all of us know from our personal and professional experience that whether we want as economic growth, whether we want more well-functioning democratic governance, whether we want peace building and social tolerance, whether we want to respond to COVID better, the research has shown that when there are higher levels of social and public trust, there are just better results at a lower cost. And so the hypothesis, if you will, of this session and the piece that Elaine Dealin and I wrote together is that if we all take a more concerted effort to build trust building into our existing work, we will not only have better results in the specific initiative we're working on, but we will also promote a broader social good that will help in all kinds of other cascading ways. So, a big win-win for everybody involved. As I said, there are a lot of wonderful people on the call. There are even more for also focused, rather profiled in the article that we wrote. But today we are very lucky to have three amazing leaders, and I will say friends and colleagues that we've brought to you today. And they're going to be talking about their own organization's practical experience in trust building. So let me give you some brief bios, and then we're going to turn it over to them. First of all, we have Swathi Masar, She has over 15 years of experience strengthening and driving inclusion in organizations around the globe, one of them being IREX, we're proud to say, and that's particularly in affected and post-conflict settings in the former Soviet Union, Middle East, and South Asia. She's led major efforts to include the incubation, growth, and independence of an NGO dedicated to promoting justice in Syria and strengthening and promoting an inclusive community development model for READ Global that builds sustained community cohesion and development. Swathi volunteers her time serving as the board co-chair of READ Global, and you'll hear more about that work today. In her day job, she is at Mercy Corps, the leader of the gender diversity and inclusion and localization efforts, and it tries to ensure that organizations become more equitable, accountable, and inclusive in all contexts where it operates. She's dedicated to listening and learning from team members. I can attest to that at all levels, and to cultivating a vibrant learning-centered movement for change. So thanks, Swathi, for being here. We also have the amazing Shamal Idris. Shamal Idris is the CEO of Search for Common Ground, a global peacebuilding organization. Many of you know it employs more than 1,000 staff driving locally led, internationally networked peacebuilding across 32 countries. Shamal has been nominated by the Quakers Shamal and Search for Common Ground, I should say, have been nominated by the Quakers for the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize, recognized by senior diplomats with having helped prevent genocide in East Africa, and acknowledged by the top foreign policy leaders in the United States and Iran for having enabled the 2015 Iran nuclear accord. So Search, and I have seen their work myself, I can validate those kudos. The Search builds peace by fostering trust and cooperation across lines of conflict until breakthroughs are achieved that can sustain peace at scale. So that's Shamal, another great colleague here. And then we have Fred Riley, who has a fantastic bio, maybe the best I've ever read. Frederick Riley grew up in Saginaw, Michigan, once voted one of the most miserable places to live in the United States. His early childhood memories include food insecurity, evictions, poverty, and more, yet there were always people at his home and his school, in his church, and in the neighborhood who showed up for him with strength and love. His life was stitched together by those people, and for him, it's a testament of the power of community relationships and mutual caring. He spent much of his career working to help lift up young adults through community programs at YMCAs around the country, and now he leads the Aspen Institute's Weave the Social Fabric Project, which connects, supports, and celebrates the people who are trust building within their community to weave a strong and inclusive social fabric. So believe it or not, those were short bios for these three distinguished people, and I could have gone on longer. Let's turn it right over to them though, and then we'll have a discussion and bring the rest of you in. So Swathi, why don't you start?
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's really an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel and group of participants. Really looking forward to the discussion. So I'll just share some examples from READ Global. And just as a way of background, READ Global is a nonprofit that facilitates the creation of self-sustaining and community-led library and resource centers that serve as a foundational platform for unlocking a community's social and economic potential. And READ has an enduring network of centers, many of which are operating sustainably for more than a couple of decades, which is pretty rare in our space, and are a testament to READ's proven approach that establishes a culture of social trust, agency, partnership, and multi-generational commitment. So trust building is an absolutely critical part of our work. And I just want to share a recent example from a partnership that we at READ Global have had with Humanity United. For years, donors have funded programs to tackle bonded labor in Nepal, in the brick kiln areas with mixed results. And so we partnered for the past couple of years with Humanity United to tackle this issue. So we worked closely with a couple of our READ centers on the Nepal-India border through a very deliberate human-centered design approach through which our teams, alongside our community centers, worked with those who are most impacted by bonded labor for about 2 years and went into a process of deep listening with the communities to really understand what is at the root cause of these issues, and how can we ensure that the people most impacted by these issues are driving the solutions. This took a long time. It took a long time to build that trust. People were hesitant, families were hesitant, and obviously nervous about what we were doing. But our community members and our team members, the Reed's team members, really took that time to listen, provide a safe space to share and hear from community members what their issues were, hearing from them on what their solutions are, helping them feel validated about their ideas and solutions. And with that, deep listening, empathy, iteration, collaboration, we were able to really work with the communities to design some meaningful ways to address these issues. And I think some key things to mention just quickly here, tips for all of us in this space. It really mattered that we worked most closely with those who were very close to these affected populations. So that representation matters. Those deep listening techniques also matters. And it's a skill that's often undervalued, but needs to be cultivated, nurtured, reinforced within our organizations. Building trust through responsiveness to needs also mattered here too. Hearing from the communities as to what they needed and cultivating trust by responding. And also creating feedback loops for accountability, making sure that people understood that they have been heard and actions that have been taken really respond to their needs. And in closing, I'll just say, this work at the community level and through our locally led work at Mercy Corps, which is a fairly large international NGO, humanitarian response and international development NGO, we've been facilitating similar conversations with our teams globally, and these very practices are the same practices, competency, skills that our teams across the world are citing as critical to unlocking enduring solutions. So just wanted to bring that piece in, that what we're learning through READ is resonating with many other development practitioners across the world.
Thank you, Swathi. And before she joined Mercy Corps, Swathi wrote while she was at IREX a deep case study of the READ methodology. It's on our website. You can just do a quick search, READ Global, Swathi, IREX. If you can't find it, we can tell you, but I want to commend it to you. So Shamal, over to you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been learning at Search?
Yeah, thank you so much. And all of us at Search have huge respect for Mercy Corps, partnered with you all. And I love getting the updates from the Weave Social Fabric project and the sort of opinion pieces and other things. I love your mailing list. So it's great to be on the panel with the two of you. I think in my perspective on this is that in the mid 90s, Swathi and everyone at Mercy Corps will know this well, the humanitarian sector really went through a crisis of conscience that was triggered by the Rwandan genocide. And whereas for many years leading up to that sector had said, look, don't bother us with issues of conflict because those are essentially political, and the humanitarian sector needs to be apolitical. We need to just provide humanitarian assistance where the greatest need is, full stop. Well, when the refugee camps, some of the refugee camps that were set up in neighboring Congo after the genocide in Rwanda enabled some of the people who led the genocide to seek safe haven, organize themselves, and essentially sow instability across that whole region, the sector was really confronted with a huge crisis and had to realize that it is not okay to ignore or pretend that conflict dynamics can be separated from humanitarian needs and humanitarian response. I have to tell you that I feel like the realization of the importance of trust, polarization, among the broader international development sector, including the philanthropic sector that supports it, has been much more slowly developing and very much intermittent. And I really want to salute the Chandler Foundation and IREX, and particularly Kristen, for the leadership in trying to elevate this on the agenda, because the increasing polarization that we see everywhere in the world, which makes every success sort of pyrrhic when it's in this win-lose kind of way, is caused by a lot of factors, but not the least of which is that we are way over-invested in very adversarial approaches to drive change. From Search's perspective, I'll give one story and then close in. trust is not a byproduct of what we do or a recent development for us. As Kristen indicated, it's sort of core to our methodology. So every single project that we apply anywhere in the world, whether here in the United States or in Afghanistan, has trust building at the core as part of the theory of change. In Kenya, a little bit less than 10 years ago, trust was one of the biggest and first casualties of the increased attacks from the Al-Shabaab violent extremist group inside Kenya. And part of what was happening is that Al-Shabaab fighters were infiltrating the country, posing as night fishermen and coming in across the shores. And in a typical way that happens with a lot of security services, including the police and others in the United States, when state security services struggle to deal with the fluidity and complexity of violence in communities, they reacted in a very heavy-handed way. In the case of Kenya, arbitrary arrests, they banned night fishing, which destroyed the local economy across the Lamu coast. Our team there recognized that this clearly was not in anyone's interests. You eroded trust between the people and the police, so there was even less cooperation. You had increased violent extremism. Al-Shabaab was more attractive to the people who suddenly had lost their jobs and livelihoods along the coast, and so embarked on a trust-building process. Our trust-building methodology is basically 3 steps: connection, finding ways to connect people across their dividing lines; collaboration, because dialogue is necessary but totally insufficient. You have to get people collaborating with one another to really build trust. And you foster that loop of connection and collaboration until you can achieve a true breakthrough. And those breakthroughs can be society-wide, nationwide. In the case of Kenya, the final breakthrough it took almost 4 years to get to was a solution, very simple, where they introduced something called Mavuvi cards. Mavuvi cards are digital registration cards that if you're a fisherman, you have to apply to get them from the government gives them to you, and then the security forces have scanners and they can scan you, and they reopen the night fishing along the coast. This is one example among literally hundreds that I could share with you, but that 3-step process of connection, collaboration, and that virtuous cycle of trust building it enables until you get a breakthrough is really the core of our methodology.
Thanks, Shamal, and thanks again for the tremendous work that your colleagues at Search are doing around the world. Fred, let's hear from you, and then let's have a bit more of a discussion with all of us and with our audience.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm honored to be with such a really great group. I feel a little inadequate because you all do such cool work all around the world. But at Weave, we believe that, the social progress really cannot happen without the foundation of trust. In 1933, when FDR was elected, our banks in this country were in shambles. People were pulling their money out because of the Great Depression. And FDR held a fireside chat after signing an emergency act. And he said, your money is better off in banks than under your mattresses. And the next day, banks around the country had received over $10 million in deposits because they trusted FDR. Right now, we don't have an elected official who can do out a calling like that in this country, and people will follow. But what we do have in this country are our neighborhood FDRs, and they are the people in our neighborhoods around the country who are helping to weave a really inclusive social fabric and who can call out to their neighbors and say, hey, go do this, and everyone will follow. And so that is why Weave is here. Our mission at Weave is to support those neighbors or those neighborhood FDRs who are building trust, but they go mostly unseen and unheard and outside of their communities. People like Charles Perry in Chicago, who spent 19 years in prison for selling drugs and then got out and said, I can't just make a fresh start. I have to do something to kind of right the wrongs that I've done. And so he became a violence interrupter working with gangs and has won awards for public safety. Or L.B. Prevette in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, who felt she was pushed out of her Appalachian town because she was queer and didn't belong. She returned and wanted to support kids like her and others who felt like they didn't belong. She opened a bar, and it is on Main Street in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. And we're headed there this weekend. We'll be in her town holding a day-long event that brings together neighbors from around the vision of their town to make it better for the next generation so they'll want to stay and be proud. We're bringing Weaver Awards there, which is a low bandwidth micro grant program that we believe that can be spread around the country, and we're starting to spread this now. We have an online community which connects weavers from around the country to help them find each other, learn, and collaborate. I'm going to share 3 really quick lessons from our work that we've been doing over the last 4 years. What we found is that even as you tackle these issues, we have to set context so it creates lasting relationships and builds for not just today, but tomorrow. And an example of that is our Weaver Network, where we connect people around the country with really meaningful, relational service opportunity that helps to build our social fabric. We believe that when people serve together, they stick together, and it is important for them to be in dialogue, but dialogue can't build a bridge. When you are in service together, the things that separate you fall by the wayside because you have this commonality of this great service that you're doing. We invite people in our work to find the common humanity and not necessarily the common ground. People like Mac McCarter, who returned home to his Shreveport, Louisiana town to find it in shambles. And he said, folks were pointing fingers at everybody about why was the community this way. So he would drive his car on Saturdays to a different neighborhood, hugging kids, holding babies, because he said, we have to show the common humanity that we have. He now leads what they call community renewal in Shreveport, and Shreveport has become a hub for this type of work all around the country. And people are paying him to come in and consult with towns, all because he decided to say, we are one person and let me show you how to do this. And one other example is that we believe you got to give ownership to the local communities. And so we started Weaver Awards because we know that these local FDRs, these community FDRs don't get funding from big groups. And so we give them a small micro grant and say, go do the work in your community. In Baltimore, Erica Gonzalez and her team there refurbished a vacant lot and an alley that was home to a lot of illegal activity. Now it's a gathering space for the neighborhood. And they've taken that project and turned it into a $4 million neighborhood renewal project. And it's all driven by the folks in the neighborhoods. Now they can put out a rally call and folks from all around the neighborhood will come because they trust them. They are the neighborhood FDRs. You know, and we believe that our problems that we have right now in our world are all human problems, but we got to include the humans in solving them. There's no federal policy, there's no president or elected officials who can guide us through this journey alone. And so our neighborhood FDRs, we have to give them funding, we have to give them resources, and we have to put them at the center of the table to help guide us through this really polarizing time that we're in. I really believe that those who serve together will stick together. And so we help to provide those opportunities to do so. You know, you can learn more of our work at weavers.org, but I'm really happy to be here and share just a little bit of the knowledge we've learned over the 3 years and how we are helping to build trust through helping to build our nation's social fabric.
Well, that was outstanding. Thanks to all three of you. We're going to open it up in just a little bit, but I wanted to press a little bit further. One of the reasons we had this session and why Elaine and I published that piece is to say, let's really get down to brass tacks. If we want to build trust and persuade others to increase trust building through their existing work, I'm going to ask you in just a second for some more practical tips. How should we do that? I already heard some. Incorporate deep listening, connection and collaboration, the importance of engaging credible local voices, inclusion. Fred, you talked about those who serve together, stick together, and I think Shamal had sort of a twist on that very same principle. So I just want to ask the three of you to keep unpacking that idea. What practically can social impact organizations do in their work, and what can philanthropists do as they're thinking about trying to encourage more trust building? Anyone can go.
Well, I'll jump in and I'll say, I think from a philanthropy standpoint, I think, you know, there's a lot of red tape to get projects funded. And it takes somebody with a PhD to fill out the 45 pages. You know, our micro grant program is 2 paragraphs and 2 click boxes and a local nominator to say this person is who they say they are. And we don't read it for grammar, and we don't read it for a logic model, but we read it for the human, the humanity inside of it, and why these folks just stepped in to solve this issue. And we believe that philanthropists have to change the way that they fund projects. We fund groups that aren't necessarily a 501c3, and we believe that philanthropists have to change the way they fund big projects or fund work around the country, because it doesn't give ownership to the local actors or the local neighborhood FDRs. And we believe that they are really the guider of where we are right now in our country.
Okay, so cut the red tape, find the local FDRs. Yep. Swathi or Shamal, want to add on?
Yeah, one thing I will say is that it was really interesting to see in this partnership with Humanity United, all the way down to our very, community-based organizations, one of the commonalities that we found was really deep listening, not for just deep listening's sake, but as you both talked about, Shyamala and Frederick, making sure that the people who are impacted by these issues are the ones who are driving the change. I think debunking this notion of who the expert is in the room is something we can all learn to cultivate. Kind of listening with our own humility and humanity is a big part of this secret. I think when we worked with Humanity United, our partners there were really phenomenal in trusting us. So I guess that trusting us as an organization that they were giving money to, we were trusting our team members who were trusting the community members who are then, and that kind of cycle needs to be, or that thread needs to be woven throughout the cycle. And really that trust comes from acknowledging that we may not have the answers and that our jobs are really to help ask good questions. And listen well. So I know that sounds kind of trite, but it was just really critical to the success of our work.
Thank you, Swati. And I see we have at least a couple of colleagues from Humanity United on the call, so maybe they'll want to jump in later. Shyamal,
I just want to add, I agree with what Fred and Swati have said, and I think it's really important to add another component to it, because to be like blunt about it, whether it's for funders or anyone who supports social change, is to stop breaking the world up into good and evil, and recognize whether what you're funding is in fact taking that perspective implicitly, even if not explicitly. So in the trend that we're seeing among both institutional and individual philanthropists and funders for greater proximity, greater localization, everything that's been shared about those who are most affected by issues should be the ones crafting and implementing the solutions and getting the funding. Well, who is most affected by these issues? And one of the things that I see, one of the greatest deficiencies I see across a lot of different causes, is that there is a perspective of, well, we're going to support the so-called victims. There are victims and there are victimizers, that the world is that clear cut. And so we're going to support those who are victimized. And one of the things that the great social change makers that I've always looked up to, whether it's like historically, whether it's like James Baldwin and Martin Luther King or internationally, Gandhi or others, they understood that oppressive systems and unjust systems trap everyone in them. And it would be obscene to say everyone suffers equally. Nobody believes that, and I'm not proposing that. But if you're going to support any social change effort, to me, the first question would be, who is affected by the solutions that are going to be crafted? And that can include, and oftentimes, like on the Kenya example, it includes, yes, the local fishermen. It also includes the police, right? And so are the efforts that you're supporting going to build the trust between all those various community members and stakeholders, or are going to support an adversarial win-lose approach where the side that you agree with the most is the one that's going to get the resourcing? And so I think in terms of proximity, I would always add to proximity pluralism. And I think one thing that funders can do, when I gave the example of the humanitarian sector, the big shift that happened there is that after the Rwandan genocide, every humanitarian organization started integrating at least conflict sensitivity into every project design and proposal. At the very least, they had to reflect on and speak to, how is this intervention not just going to address human needs, but how is it going to influence the conflict dynamics? And recognizing that if we build this hospital over here because people need it most, we're understanding that, oh, gee, that's only going to serve one ethnic group because the other one doesn't go here. And that's going to really fuel this conflict. I think anyone supporting social change needs to take a similar kind of approach to at least asking the question, how is this going to build trust at the same time as it solves whatever problem it is that I care about?
I think that was so well said, Shyamal. And I think basically what you're pointing to is that when we fall into the trap of demonizing, we tend to just create more demons. And it gets to be a vicious circle, which trust gets harder and harder to build. Let me ask you all another question. You all talked about the positives, all the positive things we need to do. And, you hinted at the successes we get when we do that. But what you're talking about is hard in practice. Can you talk about some of the obstacles? I mean, if deep listening and collaboration, all that we're talking about, were so easy, probably everyone would do it. So why don't you talk a bit about the minefields, the obstacles, like why are we finding this so hard?
Yeah, I'll give one example. We're headed, I think I said earlier, I'm headed to Wilkesboro, North Carolina in a couple of hours. And we're headed to a part of the country where people have a different set of political ideologies than I do, who vote way differently than I do. And it took us several months, about 6 months on the ground to know that we're going to fill up a room tomorrow with people. And so we had to come in and have, as Swati said, we had to listen, have a ton of conversations, and we really had to till the ground a lot before it's fertile enough for us to go in and host this event. Because I and my team are seen as these liberal leftists from Washington, D.C. coming in to tell us that we're doing everything wrong. And I'm not there to tell them they're doing anything wrong. What I'm there to tell them is that you will be stronger if you decide to work together on the issues that you all see as issues. You may come at it differently. And so we originally were just going to go in and launch this event. And they were like, wait, whoa, hey, who are you and why are you coming? And so we recognized that we needed to course correct and go in and have a ton of community conversations and have them get to know us, because if we can't help them build trust if they don't trust us. And so that's one of the lessons we learned that was like glaring at us.
Great points, Fred. Thank you. Swati, Shamal, any thoughts?
I would encourage there's oftentimes like sort of a very problem-based analysis or approach, which in really complex settings or where things are really going wrong, maybe Fred, what sounds like where you grew up, the way it was described, there are so many things going wrong that like taking a problem-based analysis is going to lead to cynicism and hopelessness.
I said some really good things about it too as well in there.
I was talking about your bio. I was talking about the bio. I know. No. I think that this asset-based approach, or looking for, if it's very as simple as if we go into any divided community, whether in my community right here in my neighborhood, or again in Afghanistan or whatever, and we ask people to talk about what's wrong, what's not going, you'll get one approach. If you ask, across the racial divides here, is there anyone you trust? With this out of control police force, is there one police captain, maybe even a beat cop who has good relationships? In this corrupt government, is there one minister who's actually appreciated and trusted by the population? And one of the things that we found is that when you take that kind of asset-based approach, 100% of the time, you get lots of answers. And it's and those are then the people that we gravitate towards, try to partner with, try to understand what they're trying to make happen and all of that. So I think taking more of an asset-based approach to how we understand who to partner with. And the last thing I would share on this is, the world is increasingly diverse and interconnected. And you've seen, I'm sure people on this call have seen these reports and Harvard Business Review and MIT Management Review and all that kind of saying, diverse teams are the most effective, right? What they don't say often is that diverse teams are also the least effective. Like the mediocre middle are the non-diverse teams, because it doesn't take a whole lot to build trust across people who have had similar cultural backgrounds, similar schooling, similar perspectives. They make the same pop culture references. What's been found is that the diverse teams, oftentimes a lot of time is spent even subconsciously wondering, if I say this, is she going to be offended, or just checking yourself and not. The reason that diverse teams are the most effective is when you add trust to the equation. When you take the time to build a diverse team that also trusts one another, then they bring the best of themselves, and they'll always outperform the less diverse teams. So that's the last thing I would say on this, is sort of taking the time, and we do this when we're building out our teams anywhere in the world, taking the time to build that true diversity where they have perspectives from and are representative of the different dividing lines that they seek to bridge.
Time, what people in our business have the least of. That's definitely an obstacle. Thank you. That was great, Shamal. Over to you, Swati, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone for comments, questions, whatever is on your mind. Go ahead, Swati.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just going to say, I think one of the things that we face most challenging is that our sector broadly is steeped in a way of doing things. Timelines, urgency, funding cycles that don't enable the type of longer term trust building, deep listening that we know that needs to happen for our communities around the world to really thrive and be cohesive and inclusive. So that, I mean, that's a big challenge. And I think also that a lot of times we're also measuring, and maybe not the most productive things, measuring, how many activities have taken place, valuing, outputs. And I don't think that our sector takes enough care, and this is across the kind of philanthropic chain, to really value things like mindsets, behaviors, leadership capacities that we know are critical to cultivating trust, cultivating inclusion, being able to deeply listen. How many of us really evaluate those things even on our performance evaluations? How many of us track those indicators in our programs? So I think there's a bit of a culture shift that needs to happen in how we measure ourselves and what we're holding ourselves accountable to.
Excellent points. Thank you. And another question is about how to measure these things, but why don't we open it up to any comments or questions from the group? You can put it in the chat, you can raise your hand. And if I don't see anything, I will ask my own additional questions. But first, I'd love to see if there's anyone in this very distinguished and expert audience who has questions or comments.
I have a question, Kristen. I'm happy to kick it off.
Sure, be my guest. Hi, Shreek.
Hi, Swati. Thanks for the shout out to Humanity United. I know my colleague Vijay is on the line. He could probably talk much more eloquently about our Nepal work. But my reflection as I was listening to the conversations is all of that makes really good sense. And I feel like there is also a larger infrastructure that actually benefits from polarization and conflict, right? Whether it's media, elites, institutions, and they have strong incentives to sort of amplify and really kind of profit in real terms from conflict. And how do you think about that larger? It's almost like this ether surrounding the work. And how do you think about doing this work and potentially countering the effects of that larger force field that's around us?
And Shreek, you talking about the force field, particularly from like the digital social media world that's kind of
social media,
yeah.
Mainstream media,
Yeah.
elites, institutions, right? I mean, I've also heard the term conflict capitalism, right? There's actual money to be made and benefits and power to be gained by fomenting and amplifying conflict. And we're trying to do this work in communities, but that force field is sort of around us.
I'll say it quick. So there's both a question of power there, and then there's a question of the ubiquity and the subconscious power that these interactive technologies are having. In terms of power, we talk a lot in our organization about Aikido politics. If you've ever seen an Aikido master or the martial art of Aikido, the goal of the martial art of Aikido is to get both you and your aggressor to a safe space, right? And so if you watch an Aikido master on YouTube or whatever, you just take 2 minutes, 30 seconds to watch, you'll never see them hit anyone. You'll never see them strike anyone. They're constantly deflecting the blows, maybe flipping their aggressor and essentially exhausting their aggressor. I'm using that analogy because in many of the places that we work, an adversarial or confrontational approach to power is going to get you at the least kicked out, at the worst killed or arrested, tortured, this kind of thing. And so what human rights activists and peace builders in some of the most oppressive settings have come to really understand and become masters of is sort of what I would call Aikido politics, which I could give an example from Liberia under Charles Taylor. Of a youth journalist program, 12-year-olds who became cub journalists initially to do nationwide news programming, and then without us even realizing that this would happen, they ended up being able to get interviews with colonels in the military and other people and actually ask them questions that no adult journalist could get away with. And the people would actually answer it because they were kids. Well, that Golden Kids news program has been written up. A number of the people who went through that program are now some of the leading investigative journalists across Sierra Leone and Liberia. And they had the impact over time of really shifting the over years, Streak, like over more than a decade of really shifting the broader context so that it was much less malleable to the kind of despotism of Taylor, right? The kind of building this broader constituency. There's a lot of examples of this, but that's in terms of the power dynamics. In terms of the social media piece, I don't want to take up any more time. I'll note our recent launch with the Center for Humane Technology of the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion, which has got a very heavy engagement from both the tech sector and peace-building practitioners and scholars specifically seeking to tackle this issue. But I have to tell you, particularly with the advent of artificial intelligence, even the most hopeful things that we're involved in and that we're seeing others do feel like throwing sandbags in front of a 1,000-foot tsunami. I'm really very concerned about the impact these things are having everywhere.
Thanks, Shamo. Swathi and Fred, do you want to add anything to that before I head to the next question?
I'll just say we've made a commitment at Weave to focus on what's working well and what's going right versus trying to fight what's going wrong, because it'll be a never-ending fight. And so our commitment is to support our neighborhood heroes, and that's what we're gonna stick to the main thing, because fighting what's on social media and these other things is just a fight we just aren't equipped to win right now.
Thanks, Fred. Swathi, you wanna bite at that apple or want to pass?
I think I'll just add, I think just a small note here too, is to what extent can we, in all of our work, figure out ways to amplify this, have people who are doing the work in these communities tell their stories as a way to, from an appreciative place, of course, as a way to counteract some of that culture. Obviously, you know, that kind of, as you described, conflict capitalism is you know, a tremendous thing to force. But I think there are ways that we can be intentional about not kind of baiting or supporting that approach, and really thinking about how do we change the narrative and who's telling stories and who has the mic.
Thanks, Swathi. And so I see we actually have several questions in the chat. I see Jed Miller has his hand up. So what I'm going to suggest is I turn first to Andy and then to Asenu to ask their questions and ask our panelists to weigh in, and then I'll take the other two. And if we're all very succinct, we'll have just the right amount of time. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Kristen.
A tough but smart question.
In the chat, I read a recent piece on polarization and social change, and this quote stood out to me in particular. You can't sacrifice justice on the altar of social cohesion. And I mean, that's an easy thing to have very abstract kind of conversations about, but with the theme of being very practical and like day to day, how do you think about this relationship of advancing justice while you're advancing social trust and social cohesion and making sure those things move together?
Great question, Andy. Usenia, let me turn to you for your question, and then we'll pause and let the panel answer, and you can choose which ones you want to take up. Usenia?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kristen. So my name is Usainu, and I'm a program officer at the Hewlett Foundation here in Menlo Park in the Bay Area. So my question is, as you know, a lot of US-based big foundation have been advocating for trust-based philanthropy for so long. Now, adding to that advocacy, there is also this recent move to localization. Many of our strategies are seeking more and more funding programs in Africa, particularly, without us having a presence in Africa. So my question is, what would you advise to us who want to continue making trust-based philanthropy in the global South without having presence in the global South?
Great question, Usainu. Thank you. And actually, I see that there's only one other question. So if you all don't mind, I'm going to call on Jed Miller to ask and then turn it over to the panel.
Thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks for this great tackling of a tough question. Swati pointed out that we're attached as a sector to certain ways of doing things. And I'm just wondering, how do we let that same dynamic, you know, such as the extractive storytelling that you mentioned, as opposed to the inclusive or the even passing the mic of storytelling downward and outward. How do we avoid projects focused on efforts like this not to repeat the same dynamic? You know, we've all seen hype cycles where it's like, oh, now we've got a trust building program. Now we've got a trust building program. What are some of the things that we can do that sort of kind of I would even say to program ourselves out of a job, which is, how do we not just demonstrate these programs and projects and claim success, but instill them over time? And how do you, I know there are people who are really gifted at measurement on this call. How do you measure a shift over time and help it to stick, perhaps even by disappearing over time?
Fantastic question, Jed. Thank you. And if we have time, I would love to come back to that issue of measurement. And as you said, I know I don't want to put people on the spot, but I know at least 2 of our audience members who are experts on the topic of measuring dynamics like this. So hopefully they'll weigh in too. Fred, Shamo, Swathi, do you want to start to tackle that list of questions?
Yeah, Andy, on your thing about justice versus social cohesion, or justice versus peace, which is sort of an age-old, and I think really unfortunate and misleading dichotomy. King's whole thing about peace is not the absence of tension, but the presence of justice, I think, is the best encapsulation of these things being really both sides of the same coin. And I think the question I would put to people who raise this is really justice for whom, right? Are we talking about justice for one community that's been long oppressed? Are we talking about justice for society and therefore a future where everybody can live in dignity, including those who have been long oppressed? And if we're talking about the latter, then I think we need to take approaches that will yield a future in which that will actually be true. And the only way I know of to really do that is to include the perspectives from all of those communities in the crafting of the solution and in driving the change. And it takes more patience and more drive, but it's to me, I feel that the justice versus peace dichotomy is very oftentimes raised within a presumption or an assumption that the best way to drive social justice is through fundamentally adversarial win-lose approaches. And I've been heartened in recent, just literally weeks, that some of the bigger foundations that support, for instance, social justice causes have been starting to ask questions about the methodologies and the theories of change that they are supporting. Might they be contributing to an overall increase in destructive conflict that serves nobody, including the communities they're most concerned with supporting? So I think this is a much deeper conversation, but I just don't buy the dichotomy the way that's put out without uncovering what are the assumptions underneath it about who you're trying to drive justice for and what approaches fundamentally drive that justice. Because I think the most powerful approaches are the ones that are completely aligned between your means and your ends. You can't create a more just and collaborative and inclusive end through a more adversarial, less dignified, win-lose methodology.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, what you're saying really resonates. When we did the study about Reed's approach while I was at IREX, one of the things that we discovered was that it was critical that the Reed team, the Reed staff, role modeled the very principles that they were trying to facilitate within the communities where it operates. So I think that Shama, I really agree with you that, and we have evidence to show that you have to use the same tactics that you're trying to see, that those things can't be in contradiction to one another. And I think the other piece of it, and Jed, you have mentioned, making sure that this isn't just another fad when we talk about trust building and having trust building programs. I think this is where my earlier comment was coming from. It just needs to be an integral part of the way that every single one of us shows up every day, shows up for our teams, shows up for our partners, shows up for the community participants, and not so much a program in and of itself, but it has to be really integrated into how we behave and treat each other. And I guess to this point of using the very same appreciative listening tactics in order to drive that kind of justice and work within the communities where we operate. So yeah, I would say that I think we just need to think of this not so much as a program, but as something that we all really value. And I guess to the measurement point that we measure and hold ourselves accountable to.
An even subtler thing to measure.
Indeed. And unfortunately, we may not get to that. We could have a whole other session on that. Swati and Shama, before I turn to Fred, and Fred, I'm going to ask you to make the last panelist comments for the day, so no pressure. But Swati and Shama, there was a question from Usainu about the Global South. And since Fred doesn't work, to the best of my knowledge, in the Global South, he's working mostly in the US context. I wondered if the two of you could quickly address that question. And then Fred, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, I was just typing a response to Usainu in the chat. So I think global North-based foundations that want to support global South organizations have more opportunities to build those relationships and networks than ever before, whether it's through some of the kind of social entrepreneur networks that have been supported and funded for the last 10 to 15 years, Ashoka and Skoll and others. They will sometimes get critiqued for, oh, gee, then you're just supporting the same old people. But a lot of due diligence and work has gone into identifying really powerful organization leaders and local civil society activists from literally every country in the world by networks like those. So getting associated with those networks, learning from them, not necessarily even just funding the people they fund, but learning from them how they've gone about that process and integrating into some of those processes and networks of information sharing can be really powerful. Forming institutional partnerships with global South-based organizations and networks that can also do this kind of work. The Obama Foundation is working very hard to establish and identify, nodes across the global South for identifying young activists and leaders, social change activists and leaders in those communities. If you're based in the US and you want to, so there are more and more of those kinds of networks that have been cultivated over the last 10 to 15 years. And I feel like almost every day new ones cropping up.
Yeah, I would say for funders, you might not need to reinvent the wheel. I think there's a little bit of an urge to reinvent the wheel. So Fred, I'm going to turn to you, and then unfortunately we're going to have to turn to Mara to close. I do want to point to Vijay's really great comments in the chat. So please take a look. Fred, the last word.
I think the last word I would say is that I think trust has ultimately given up control, essentially, and it's how do you allow communities to lead? So the philanthropy question, the way we attack our giving in this country is by hiring somebody in the local community to be the person who represents us, because they know the community, they understand the characters, and also suspending in your head what a leader looks like and what they sound like and how they operate. I tend to think a leader wears a blue blazer and khaki pants, right? And that doesn't happen that way in every community. And so sometimes if you really want to make sure that funding gets to the global South or anywhere, and you want it to be in a trusting relationship, you have to probably move out of the way. And so don't reinvent the wheel. And that's what we hope to do at Weave, is to allow communities to lead. So thank you.
Thanks, Fred. And before I turn it back to Maura to close, I just really want to thank all of you, our panelists, for their phenomenal work every day, but also for some really succinct but very insightful thoughts. I want to thank everyone for being here. I know so many of you are working every day on this issue. My colleagues and I at IREX are really trying to be very concerted and integrating trust building into our work, and we'll be sharing more resources. We're working on developing some, and we'll try and put them out there in the community, and would love your thoughts. So Maura, back to you to close. Huge thanks to the Chandler Foundation.
Yes. And thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much to our panelists. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And again, as I said, we at the Chandler Foundation are genuinely on a learning journey, and we welcome and have had the good fortune to be able to work with some of the folks on this call, and we looking forward to working with others, because frankly, this is such a massive question. We don't want it to be a fad, as Jed mentioned. It's something that fundamentally there's no way we can do the work that we cannot do without challenging them. I'd like to raise here just some things that really struck me from today's conversation, which is that, there has been a genuine and positive movement, I think, in the last, say, 4 or 5 years. And this is all due to the Trust-Based Philanthropy Initiative that has done most of this work, and they've done tremendous work across the philanthropic sectors, really helping philanthropists be brave, or allow themselves, as Frederick said, to just give up power, to talk to people, to listen to people, to realize that a lot of these constraints that philanthropy puts on itself are its own. We don't necessarily work for governments. We don't have election cycles. So these kind of analysis paralysis, or this, these questions about how we measure and what we measure, are things that are self-imposed. All the more reason for us to be rethinking them. Swati kind of brought up the point. Are we measuring the right things? Are we looking at the right things? We keep, our behavior, our mindsets. And then Shamal, I just loved going at this from the point of view of let's look at this as asset-based. We're always tackling problems. Let's look at what do we all have together? And so from each one, and then Frederick, of course, who's always we hear such wonderful things, and I'm dying to hear about what happens down in Wilkes-Barre, so please fill us in. But he's been able to build up this organization in 3 years that are finding these just gems of people on the ground that are doing things that, our country now needs and our world needs now more than ever. We are wired to trust each other, to work together, to be partners with each other. And philanthropy, its role is to help people to do that. We don't have the answers. We just happen to, for whatever lucky reason, to be in a position where we have private capital for public good. But that's society's risk capital. Let's be brave with it and go in and support people like this and really think about what we should be doing this. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. We really are very grateful for this, and hope that we can continue this conversation in some form or fashion. We do not have a direct conversation after this, but we are very welcome and open to ideas, and we're very grateful to Kristen and her team. Thank you.